Forgive me sitting upon this stool. This is a new gimmick that is used by artists these days. The idea, of course, is to give an impression of relaxation. It is what is known in my profession as the Dave Allen myth. If an actor doesn't know what to do with his hands, he has a walking stick. If he doesn't know what to do with his mouth, he has a cigarette. I have a stool. Now, my name is Jon Pertwee, which it isn't. Not truly. My real name is Jon Pertwee de Layevo, and I hope you're very impressed. I come from a long line that my mother should never have listened to, a French line of Huguenots. The majority of my family was, in fact, Catholic in France. In 1865, they pushed out the Protestants, and there was one Protestant, a man called Georges de Pertwee de Layevo, and he moved into Suffolk, and the large Pertwee clan, as it's known today, is the result of his personal athleticism. And nobody could pronounce the name properly, Pertwee de Layevo, P-E-R-T-H-U-I-S. They couldn't pronounce it, so the illiterate English pronounced it Pertwis. So it was duly changed to P-E-R-T-W-W. The result is they called it Pee-wee, etc., etc. And when I was in America, I was working on Broadway, and I used to walk down Broadway, and I looked up, and there it was, Jon Pertwee, and I was so proud of the fact my name was in lights. And after 6 months, I walked into the theatre one day, and there was the stage doorkeeper, sitting at the end of the passage, smoking his big stogie, and he said, "Hey, Jan." And I paid no attention, of course, my name not being Jan, and I walked on merrily into the theatre. And he said, hey, Jan. And I said, "Who, me?" He said, "Yeah, Jan Putrid, there's a letter for you." So from that moment onwards in America, I was always known as Jan Putrid, which I suppose is better than when I was standing outside Grosvenor House many years ago. Somebody came up to me and said, "Excuse me, but weren't you Jon Pertwee?" That's nice, isn't it? Weren't you Jon Pertwee? And the lady, this is an extraordinary story. It's not that funny, but it's an extraordinary story. There's a lady, and she came up to me when I was with a great dear friend of mine, and she said, "Excuse me, but aren't you Helen Twelvetrees?" And I said, "Helen Twelvetrees is a very elderly character actress." And she said, "That's right." That's true. On another occasion, I remember getting into a train. I was going to see a Doctor Who conference, and I usually wear the sort of Doctor Who gear when I go to these conferences, and I had my Doctor Who cape on. And I tried to find somewhere in this train that was empty, and the whole train was absolutely full. And I walked up, and there was a compartment that was empty, but it had a little label stuck in the window. It said, "This compartment is reserved for people from St. Thomas's Hospital." And so I thought, there's nobody there, so I'll go in. And I sat down, and just as the train was leaving, the door opened, and in came two men in white coats with a collection of people all a bit doolally-taps. They all sat down very happily, and the nurse thought he'd count everybody up and check them all out, and he said, "Right, now let's have you, and let's have a little count here. Now then, 1, 2, and he looked at me, he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Doctor Who." He said, 4, 5, 6. Anyway, as I was telling you, I come from a long theatrical family. My father was Roland Pertwee. He was an eminent playwright, and some of you may remember as a writer. He was a scenarist. He worked a lot in Hollywood and in England writing movies. My Uncle Guy, he looked after me when I was very little because my father and mother split up when I was tiny. My mother took one look at me and went, "Ooh, no," and she left. And so my granny looked after me. And my Uncle Guy, too. I would like to take... guys, look here, Mother. Mr. Pertwee, he taught elocution as a lesson. He was the professor of the Guildhall School of Music and Drama at the Guildhall, and he taught elocution. Extraordinary how he managed. He was the only man I ever knew who had a motor car, and he didn't change gear to go uphill. He leant forward slowly. Uncle Guy. My grandmother was an opera singer. She had the sort of voice you use to augment grief at funerals. Lovely voice, though, she had. Dame Eva Moore. Her daughter was Jill Esmond, and Jill Esmond married Laurence Olivier, the world's greatest actor, in my opinion, it was. And let me give you an example of why I say that. He was very shy in many ways. He didn't like people approaching him from the back. Understandable in some ways, but he did it from the front, fine. The back, no. And we went to a party once, and I said, come on, Larry, we're going to this lovely party. He said, no, I'd really rather. I said, yes, you're going. He said, I said, yes, you're going. So we took him and we put him on a sofa, and we gave him drink and a sandwich, and we said, no, you'll be all right. And he started to relax when an elderly lady came up behind him, and she clapped her hands over his eyes, and she said, guess who? And that's exactly the sort of thing he hated. So he went, and the lady fell backwards, and she fell against the settee behind, and she went AOT over the settee with the legs in the air, with the black bombazine knicker well to the fore, and he paid no attention to it at all, and he went over to his host, and he said, who is that old woman? He said, oh, that's my mother-in-law. He said, isn't she marvellous? Doesn't that prove to you that's the world's greatest actor? Anyway, my father married again. He married a lady called Dorothy. I didn't care for her at all. She was the sort of proverbial stepmother as far as I was concerned. And so when they went down to Devonshire to live, we had a house on the River Exe down in Dulverton, near Tiverton. It was a great life, really, for a boy. We had a farm, and we had horses for hunting. We had the house on the top of a hill, and the postman used to come, and he used to deliver letters for miles around to the farms. He'd walked the equivalent of 4 times round the world in gumboots. So you can imagine the condition of his feet. On his way in, he used to call into the pubs, you see, and have a few pints of scrumpy. And so by the time he got to our house, he'd had a few, you see. And he used to look up at the house on the top of the hill, and he'd look and he'd say, I ain't going up there. Boy, no, I ain't going up there. Let them young bastards come down and get it. And with that, he'd take the letters and he'd throw them over the gate into the field, into the mud. And my father would be looking through his binoculars and said, good God, the damn man's done it again. And he said, go on, boys. He said, down you go, a penny each to collecting the mail and bringing it up. Now, he'd had a rather too many scrumpies and he wasn't too fit. So they got another postman and they hauled him out of retirement. And he was extremely old. He was 83. And he had his old hat that he'd been using. And one of them 4-peak and half hats. Do you remember? Anybody remember him? The little postman's hat, the little thing, that hard hat. Well, his name was Pa Curtis, and he was over 80, and he had eyebrows that stuck up there like that. And Pa Curtis said, Coral, he said, I'm going to be the fastest postman in the West Country. He said, don't worry about that. He said, I'm going to be faster than Woolacombe in his gumboots. I get a bike. And he bought a racing bike. 83 years of age, he bought a racing bike with bent handlebars and a very hard saddle. And he used to deliver the letters at enormous speed. And one day he disappeared. We couldn't find him anywhere. And I said, where's Pa Curtis? They said, haven't you heard? Oh, he said, he's had a terrible accident. He said, he was going up Studley Hill, he said, against the wind. He said, his head down, his ass in the air, pedaling away up the hill. He said, and he bent down so far, he got his eyebrows caught in the front spokes. He said, add him off, quick as a trice, he said. He said, he's in the hospital. And so I went to see him, and I said, Pa, what have you done? Or he said, I was going too fast, he said, Master John, too fast. And I said, well, I'll tell you something, Pa, I'll give you a good bit of news. I said, I've just put on the air, on a radio show, I've got a postman, and I call him Postman Curtis. And I said, and it's all based on you, so when you listen and you hear an old man say, wow, what does it matter what you do, so long as you tear him up? That's you. Do you remember that character? Do you? Yeah, a long time ago, Waterlog Spa with Eric Barker, and that was based on old Pa Curtis. Now, of course, during this period of time I was at school. Not for very long at any school. That's the story of my life, really. I was expelled from everything. I went to a school called Aldrow at Eastbourne. I was 7.5 years of age and was beaten and thrashed for swinging on a lavatory chain. Still, I had great fun. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I went to another school after that, which I enjoyed. There was a headmaster called P.C. Underhill. He weighed about 22 stone, an ex-rowing blue. He didn't beat you with a cane, he beat you with a fives bat. So with 22 stone behind him, when he hit you with the five bat, your head went straight through the wall opposite. But the extraordinary thing was I liked him. I liked him. Through my life, I've sort of liked the most extraordinary people. People who are fierce and supposed to be bad and supposed to be angry and supposed to frighten you, and they don't. And I liked him. I wasn't expelled from there. I went to Sherborne Public School after that. Hated that. Hated the whole system of fagging. Hated everybody in it. And I was expelled from Sherborne because I did a great and original thing which went into the history books. I beat my fag master. Instead of him beating me, I beat him. And my father decided the best thing to do was to superannuate me and remove me and send me to another school. I went to a co-educational school with girls. What a splendid arrangement. I did enjoy myself. I built an open-air theatre there. I learned languages there. I had a marvellous time. A wonderful life. Frensham Heights. I thoroughly recommend it. A great house and a great, great school. I rode a motorbike there once, and I drove it straight into a wall within 15 minutes of buying it. As I hit the wall, I went over the wall and hit in the middle of a tea party. And somebody said, "Oh, hello, you're late." That was a wonderful original line. And I left school. I decided the best thing I was doing was going to the theatre. Everybody else in my family had been in the theatre, of course. And so I decided that I'd try to get into a dramatic school. And I said, "I'll go to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art." Oh, I thought I'll get in there. Yeah, sure I will. Mark you, my father was a governor, so I did stand a little chance. So I went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and I hadn't been there more than 2 terms before I was sent for by the principal, Sir Kenneth Barnes. And he said, "Pertwee, I'm going to tell you, I'm very much afraid that I'm going to fire you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I have been speaking to your Greek teacher, Mrs. Wheeler, and she tells me that you have refused to be a wind." I said, "Well, yes, it's perfectly true. I have refused to be a wind. I mean, it's pretty silly. My father paying all this money for my education in the theatre, and all I've got to do is go, ooh, ooh, that's what you do as a Greek wind. Ooh, hundreds of you lining the side going, ooh." And I said, "No, I don't want to be a Greek wind. I want to be an actor." And he said, "You'll be a wind and like it." And I said, "No, I'm sorry." And he said, "Very well. You will leave at the end of this term." So I thought I didn't last there long. I did a play at the end of that term. In that play, as all students, you play more than one part. I played the part of the man who was murdered in the first act, and I played the part of the detective who found out who murdered me in the last. I had great makeup. I had hair parted in the middle, little tash and a monocle for the first character, and then the detective, the dirty old raincoat and the battered hat and everything. And I was really rather proud of myself. And there were only 2 very small parts. But when it was over, Kenneth Barnes said to Noel Coward, who was the guest of honour, and he said, "Was there... Did you think... Did you find any talent? Did you... Were you impressed? Did you... Did you like... Did you?" And Noel Coward said, "Yes, very interesting, very, very good performance from a man who played the part of the man who was murdered in the first act. And I particularly liked the part of the detective who found out who murdered him in the last." Well, having played both parts, I was naturally very thrilled, and so I leapt forward and gave him a kiss, and very dangerous thing to do. But as he was a sort of guru of mine, a sort of godfather of mine, a great friend of my dad's, it was all right, and he was a great influence on my life in the theatre from then on. And I actually had the joy of working with him. Amazing wit, that lovely story about Noel Coward when he was watching the coronation. And it was a terrible day in the coronation, you may remember, some of you. It was pouring with rain, and the Queen wanted to be in the open carriage, and she couldn't because she'd been soaked. And everybody would have been soaked, so they were all in the carriages sort of doing this, through the windows, and all the crowd was sitting out in the rain. It was awful. It was a heartbreaking day. But Noel Coward was sitting in a grandstand, covered and quite dry. And all the carriages went by, and when he and his friend were looking and saying, very good, very boring. And suddenly an open carriage went by, with a lady in it, a vast lady, Queen Salote of Tonga. And she'd melted. All the rain had melted her. And her hung down, like spare